Gyotaku. Gyo means fish. Taku is to create a rubbing out of something, a copy. Putting fish in front of taku, it turns into Gyotaku, which literally means a fish rubbing, a fish printing. That's what I first saw and fell in love with in Japan. I was at a tackle shop, and my first reaction was like, whoa, that's so cool. I mean, it looks like a fossil on paper. And I wanted to just stay true to that. So I stayed with the same ink, the same papers, the same process. My uncle, he's the one who taught me how to fish, and he would take me. I remember telling him once that I like this so much because it's just me out there. Art is much the same way with me. It's just me and the paper. If I fail, I fail. I can grab another sheet of paper and do it again.
Welcome to the Katie C. Sawyer podcast. I'm your host, Katie, and today I have a special guest on. Dwight Hwang is a Gyotaku artist, which is a Japanese method of fish printing. Dwight is so successful in his work, however, that it has been showcased in some of the world's most luxurious hotels, fine dining restaurants, clothing lines. I think you've even had work in the Smithsonian. Dwight, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Dwight, we first started talking on Instagram back in 2021, I believe. It might have been 2020, but I think it was 2021 when your work was showcased on some new clothing I had received from Pelagic. Now, I was blown away by how beautiful it was. I think you still have a line with them, correct?
Correct.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's really, really beautiful work. But to start off this conversation, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what Gyotaku is and what that means?
Okay. Well, firstly, it's pronounced Gyotaku. Yeah. When you say gyu, well, gyo means fish. And then, but if you say it gyu means, it actually means beef. So unless I'm printing like a sirloin steak or a flank steak or something, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
It's a good thing I've had lunch because that sounds delicious. So it's Gyotaku.
Gyo. It's like saying
yo. So gyu is beef, gyo.
There you go.
Gyotaku.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I completely lost track of the question.
Okay. Let's tell our guests a little bit about what I'm nervous now. Gyotaku is.
Okay.
And what that means.
Okay, so Gyotaku,
which we kind of already covered.
we went through the pronunciation. Okay, so Gyotaku. Gyo means fish. Taku is to create a rubbing out of something, a copy. If you were to analyze the Chinese character for it, the kanji, Japanese kanji, it means like a stone rubbing from like a stone epitaph, and that's how they they had the epitaphs, and they would print it, and that's how they would recreate something. And so putting fish in front of taku, it turns into Gyotaku, which literally means a fish rubbing, a fish printing.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It started in the 1800s. The story goes, there's two stories that I often hear from my Japanese friends. One is, the main story is that there's a samurai lord named Sakai, and he used to love to fish, and when he would catch a fish, he would bring it back to his court, and he or somebody, his court calligrapher or somebody, would write down all the juicy details that fishermen are they geek out on. The weight, how it fought, what they caught it on, all that stuff. Things don't change. But instead of writing all about it, they took the same Sumi ink, the calligraphy ink that you see on, Chinese, East Asian scrolls and whatnot, brushed it onto the fish, pressed the paper on top of that, and essentially they made a handprint but using a fish, and it's sort of stuck ever since. So it started as a way of recording and showing off. Naturalists started using it as well, and to record things that they would find of natural history. And then there's a more utilitarian version of the story where when, from what I understand, like I guess Tokyo, when it was Edo, the laborers were all converging onto that city, and the majority of them were illiterate, they couldn't read. And so instead of if you ever go to like old parts of Japan, they don't have menus at restaurants. It's all written on the walls. And so if you're illiterate, oh, you're out of luck. And so instead, what they would do is they would print the fish in the morning and post it up, pin it up, tack it somewhere, and so someone across the street can immediately see it and understand that, oh, they have red sea bream today, or they have pickled mackerel today, or whatever it was. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I haven't ever heard that second version. That's fascinating. It makes total sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah.
I love that in the first one that fishermen wanting to tell their stories, which is something that is just so consistent across time and space, right?
Yeah.
Fishermen wanting to tell their stories started this entire medium, right?
Yeah.
But additionally, having that as a, what's the word I'm looking for? A graphic menu. It makes sense. It's like going, you go to like a Mexican food restaurant in South Texas and there's photos all over the menu. And
Exactly.
I love that. I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I want. Like I speak Spanish pretty darn fluently, but I still like to look at the photos and pick. That's awesome. Okay. So how many different types of Gyotaku are there? And what do those different versions look like?
So in Japan, there's two different versions. One is called chokusetsu. The other one is called kansetsu. Chokusetsu is the direct printing, where they directly apply the ink onto the fish and then press the paper on top of that. That's usually the version that you would see. There's another version called kansetsu, indirect. And what that is, they'll take a fish, they'll apply paste onto it, glue the paper on top of it. It's a light glue on top of that, and then they would take a dauber made out of silk and load that up with pigment, and then tap all across the fish's body until the image and the desired colors or whatever starts to appear. This process takes a lot longer. I've tried it a few times. It's mind-numbing.
Yeah,
but
tedious.
It's pretty tedious. But it was developed by artists because they wanted more control. The results look different. I'm not a big fan of it, unless it's done really, really well. Then it's absolutely gorgeous. But it can take anywhere from like 2 hours to. I mean, I've known artists who have worked on a single fish for days, and you can't eat the fish afterwards.
It takes. I mean, when you're working on a fish for that long,
at room temperature, then I'd stay away from it.
But you can't eat the fish afterwards. But
but I mean, you get very different results. It's
very different,
softer looking. As far you can eat your fish if you're using non-toxic materials, using the other method, the more direct method, but not with the indirect method. That's just Japan. And then there are these different versions of Gyotaku all over the world, depending on who the people are. For example, the Hawaiians have their own version. I just call it Hawaiian Gyotaku, where they'll print the fish and then they'll paint over it and basically render out a fully colored version of it. It's very pretty. You don't see the rest yet. Like the original print is sort of lost under all the paint, but that's what they enjoy, and I enjoy looking at them. It's pretty neat. Folks in Europe, they'll have their own take on it. They're much more liberal, experimental with what they do.
That's really cool. Okay, so it definitely would make sense that people all over the world would have developed their own version of essentially keeping this memory of a fish alive and doing that in a way that's artistic and utilizing the fish firsthand if that fish is being harvested. There are several different ways to keep a fish or to trophy a fish. A lot of people don't know that like skin mounts, for example, aren't a thing anymore. Like that's not really that we don't do that. It's really hard to do and it doesn't really like hold up very well, but you can get mold made based on size and measurements. And a lot of fish mounts these days are molds.
Right.
However, your art form I find extremely fascinating because it's beautiful in its own unique way. And real quick, I guess before I get into that, from the outside looking in, without knowing anything about the art form, one might assume that essentially to do direct versions of Gyotaku, did I say it right?
Perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I didn't roll my eyes if you noticed.
Okay, cool. So I'll just look for the eye roll.
Yeah.
Okay, so please be consistent with that. So in the from the outside looking in, one might assume that all it is, quote unquote, is putting some paint on the fish, putting a piece of paper on top, and peeling the paper back, kind of like a temporary tattoo, checking it out. And it's like, just don't smear it, like that's all you got to do. But surely that's not the case. Can you dive into a little bit more detail of what that is for you, where I'm wrong there in that interpretation, and what you look for in a fish?
You're absolutely not wrong at all. Yeah. I mean, so Gyotaku is like anything else. For example, just about anyone can learn how to ride a bike, right? They learn how to ride bikes when they're kids and they have it forever. But like, not everyone turns into some BMX, off-road all-star.
Definitely.
And folks like that, they become that because one, they're maybe they're naturally gifted and talented, or they're just born daredevils. But mostly, it's just a lot of practice, lots and lots of practice, a whole lot of time invested. So you're not wrong. This is an accessible art. Anyone can do it, but like everything else, there's lots of improvement. Now, you take the Japanese, for example, and they're sort of notorious for taking something and just spending their entire lifetime to try to refine it and perfect it, right? Like, I'm sure, I assume you like sushi.
I love sushi.
All right. Well, think about like a traditional sushi chef in Japan. Like, there are these stories where apprentices will work under this famous sushi chef for 10 years. All they do is cook rice. That's all they do. Now, and then after that, they graduate and they can finally start cutting fish. But if you think about it, oh, that sounds awful. But man, can you imagine how good their rice will be after 10 years of doing the same thing over and over and over?
It's got to be perfect.
It's got to be perfect. Like, I think by that point, you would have no choice but to make really, really good rice. So it's the same thing.
Hopefully. Oh my gosh, I hope
oh my
so.
gosh. Yeah.
Otherwise, maybe something else.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be a tough.
But yes, for sure, exactly.
Right. So just, the same with Gyotaku. Anyone can do it. Your results will vary from your first try to, you might, like my first try is just it's real messy. I mean, it is what it is. But
yeah.
But you put time into it and you start refining and start looking for ways to better your process. Like for me, it was important to me to want to stay with the original medium. That's what I first saw and fell in love with in Japan. I was at a tackle shop. I was like, whoa, those are so cool. And I wanted to just stay true to that. So I stayed with the same ink, the same papers, the same process. And the Japanese are real big sticklers about not touching things up afterwards, except for the eye, because the eye doesn't print. You have to hand paint that in. And so, I met a lot of the Japanese masters over there, and when they see a Gyotaku that has been embellished, they jut out their lower jaw and shake their heads, and that's it.
Judge.
Yeah. Oh yeah, big time. And so, but also, like, I don't consider myself judgmental, but like it's important for me to apply these rules and guidelines to my own art and my own life, because I guess ultimately, I have two choices. I can be really, really, I could spend the time and I could be really good at embellishing and fixing or whatever. Or I could spend the same amount of time and just be better at the printing itself. And so that's what I want.
I like that. I like that. Yeah. And I don't think, to each his own, to each his
Absolutely.
own, whatever artist wants to do,
Mhm.
whatever. Just same thing in the cockpit, like I rig my tackle a certain way. I find that my tackle is rigged the best way.
Mhm.
But if somebody does it differently, I'm not going to judge them. However,
No.
I am going to pay attention to it,
Yeah.
see
Like
how
you
it
might
goes,
learn
see how it
something.
makes. Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
exactly. And maybe it might transfer into my work. Maybe it might not.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. And I think that this is a good way to segue into a little bit more about you individually, your background, where you came from, and how you got to where you are in your
Okay.
work today. You're Korean American, correct?
Yes, I was born here. Yeah.
Awesome. And where what was your childhood like? Did you always want to be an artist? Did you go to school for art? What was that like?
So I always wanted to do art. I didn't, as far as back as I could remember, I didn't want to go outside, do sports, um, or anything really other than fishing. Like I would go outside to go fish. I would get forced to play sports, but I hated it. All I wanted to do was just bury my head into a stack of paper and just draw. That's all I wanted to do. And so I have all these baby photos, whatever, toddler photos or whatever, just, me drawing at my little table. Every grade, all the way through high school, there was always a comment from the teacher at the end of the year saying he should follow art because he loves it. And it was hard to ignore because like my homework, my textbooks, everything would just be covered in doodles. That's all I wanted to do. My parents weren't supportive of that. They hated it, hated the idea of me following that. Very traditional. Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand where they're coming
from. Are your
from,
parents Korean immigrants?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean that make it, culturally that kind of makes sense.
Right.
Right?
It's all sort of shunned and
yeah. And like how are you going to make money as an artist kind of mindset.
Yeah.
So what okay, wait, before you continue, I think it's interesting. I say that a lot, but I do. I think it's interesting that your two favorite the two things you like to do as a child were art and go fishing.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to read into that a little bit with you. Like why do you think what do you think about it was about fishing when you didn't really like being outside and playing sports and that sort of thing? What do you think it was about fishing that attracted you as much as, or in some ways, or as maybe not as much as, but attracted you in the way that art attracted you?
Yeah, easy answer. So my uncle, he's the one who taught me how to fish and who would take me fishing. He was the one who married into the family. No one else fishes in either side of the family. And so he would pick me up every Friday or Saturday and we'd go to the piers and stuff and just fish. And I remember telling him once that I like this so much because it's just me out there. And it's sort of like a self-challenge. Like it's challenging myself to do this, figuring it out, trying to trick some creature to like bite the hook. And yeah, I don't know. It was just that really. And so art is much the same way with me. It's just me and the paper. If I fail, I fail. I didn't grab another sheet of paper and do it again. Fishing's the same. If I skunk that day, I'll go again. But it's really satisfying when things work out.
That's beautiful. I totally agree. It's yeah, that's really nice. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Los Angeles, in East LA, and then our family sort of moved around all over the place along the West Coast. And then ultimately, I found myself in Cal Arts, this sort of prestigious art school, because I wanted to learn how to do film and animation.
How'd you get there?
That was
your
tough.
Family wasn't super supportive of the trajectory you wanted to go in.
Oh, let me tell you about that. So I had just got accepted into a school where my parents were like, "Oh yeah, that's not bad," and and I got the acceptance letter, and I was like, "Man, this sucks. I don't want to go," and
What were you going to study?
well, I didn't know what I wanted to study, but my dad wanted me. He realized that I don't have the brains for this or that, become a doctor, attorney, or whatever, all the, Asian stereotypes that, good Asian kids follow. And so he said, you know, you can learn economics, be a businessman. I was like, oh, that sounds awful. Like I'm terrible at that. I break the Asian stereotype when it comes to math, like 100%. Can't do it. Can't do it. And so
There's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that. But at the time, there was everything wrong with it. And
fishing and art, Dad.
And
I laugh because I feel like so many of us, like in the world of fishing, we're like, I want to go fishing. And our parents are like,
and
how are you going to make money from that? Anyway,
Exactly.
Continue. Okay, so you got into a university and your parents were like, okay, that's acceptable.
Yeah, but then I got a bad case of cold feet, and I was like, I don't want to do this. And so, without telling them, I applied to a art school, that art school that I told you about, Cal Arts, and they gave me a score. I didn't get accepted. They gave me a score at like 5 point something out of 10. I was like, oh, because they never allowed me to take art lessons before.
Yeah.
And so I met up with one of the counselors, and they said, yeah, you really need to, focus on your quick drawings, your sketches and stuff, drawing a human figure as fast as you can. I was like, okay. And so they recommended that I learn from this guy named Glenn Vilpu in Burbank. And I was in Sacramento at the time. And so secretly, for a while, I would take a flight once a week to go meet this guy and learn under him for the entire day.
What year was this?
1992, maybe? Or
yeah. So Zoom was not an option.
No, far from it.
Were
I don't
you
even think the
18?
internet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. 1992. That's before The Lion King came out. Like,
Yeah.
That's a weird fact to know. But and you were 18, secretly taking a flight once a week to an art lesson. Okay. How'd you pay for that?
So I did everything I could. I eventually told my mom, and she was like, oh, she had an emotional breakdown, and it was kind of awful.
I'm sorry.
But for a while, even she was like, yeah, we could do this, but we're not going to tell anyone else.
Your dad.
Like, oh, yeah. But eventually he found out too. And
yeah, I assume so.
Yeah, all hell broke loose. But I did that for 7 months.
Wow.
Commuting once a week to do that. And I created a new portfolio, and I submitted that in, and I immediately got accepted with a score of 9.2.
Amazing.
And then
good for you.
Thanks. I got featured in not only the Korean newspaper, but I got featured in the LA Times as well as this kid that was flying back and forth to do this.
That's so cool. Were your parents like? Did they start to see your vision a little bit more at that point in time?
No, they were sort of like just it's just a phase. He'll return, and like they went as far as talking to the dean, calling him up, and asking him to discourage me from continuing.
I'm sorry, that could not have been easy.
No, it wasn't easy. In fact, a lot of times I would find out from the dean, which he was on my side, and so he was really helpful about how to navigate all that.
That's good.
But in the end, I graduated. I won the first place for short films for the Student Academy Awards. And
wow.
Yeah, it was pretty neat.
That's super neat.
I did another film, and that got accepted into the official selection at the Cannes Film Festival.
Cannes, nice.
Yeah,
good for you.
It was crazy.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
So animation, I'm assuming?
Right, but I was never an animator. It was the storytelling part of it that attracted me the most.
Awesome.
And that's just I loved storytelling. Um, I love writing. I love drawing storyboards. Yeah, like I
Well,
would
that
watch a movie.
shows in your work today, like, that I think that that's one of the things that I like so much about your work is it's not just a print, it's a story. There's something behind each piece of art, but we'll get to that. Sorry,
Oh,
I
no worries.
digressed.
Oh, okay.
So, wow. So then you were submitted into the Cannes Festival, which is huge. That's like a
Yeah,
really big deal,
it's
and
like the
it sounds,
Olympic Games of film.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for sure. Huge. So I guess your career just took off in filmmaking.
yeah. And so while I was there in France, I sort of got headhunted by this director and this producer from Japan. The director, he made movies like very iconic movies. One's called Ghost in the Shell, um, Oshimamoru, and basically they invited me over for an internship, and so I went. Um,
Wow.
I had
How old were
no,
you?
I was, I don't know, 25, 26,
Oh, it's
something like
so
that.
accomplished. That's so cool.
It was pretty neat.
So how long was your internship in Japan?
For a year, and it was pretty humbling. It wasn't anything like internships here in the States. You don't get paid. I had sponsors though that were helping me out with just living expenses, but um, it's
You were making
unpaid
rice?
basically. Like I would serve tea. I would scrub toilets. It felt like I was doing everything but filmmaking. Like when you watch Karate Kid and Mr. Miyagi like tells you to paint the
Yes.
fence. It was like that.
That's
And
awesome.
so I just really, I was grumbling the entire way. But, in retrospect, I'm glad I went through that um, because I ended up learning so much about not just me, but people in general. Um, and, an incredible humbling that happens when you go through something like that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it was really good.
That's awesome. So, did you speak Japanese? Like, where are you at there? Because you had an internship in Japan for a year, but you lived in Tokyo for a
7.
while, didn't
Yeah,
you? So what
yeah.
happened? What happened next? How did that turn into
So
7 years in Tokyo?
yeah, I didn't speak Japanese. As like most Americans, I just assumed that the rest of the world spoke English, and so
Mm,
as soon as I get off the plane, I'm like, oh, nobody speaks English. Uh, but fortunately, I was able to pick up the spoken language fairly quickly, um, really quickly. I ended up learning how to uh, read through texting. Um,
wow.
yeah, and so I can type fine now and read and whatnot. But it was all sort of by immersion, really. Um,
Yeah. Did you grow up speaking Korean in the household?
I did, yeah.
Okay. So for me,
Mhm.
French is one of my first languages.
Oh,
I'm Belgian
cool.
American.
Uh-huh.
And as a result, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, they're all I'm pretty quick to pick them up because
Uh-huh.
they're Latin languages.
Right.
But I don't know very much at all about Asian languages.
Mhm.
Is your Korean background, what do you think that played into picking up Japanese so quickly?
I think so. The grammar is very similar. The words are
Okay.
different. Um, there are differences. Just because I'm Korean doesn't mean I can pick up anything in Japanese, but
Mhm.
the grammar structure is very similar. It's
That's the case in Latin languages too, is it's the fact that the sentences are assembled the same.
right.
Right. That makes a big difference.
That makes a big difference. Yeah.
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 But how cool. Okay, so you through immersion you got to pick up on the language pretty quickly,
Yeah.
which is amazing. I think that, getting exposed to different cultures and languages and parts of the world is so important, especially in our 20s, in our young years
Absolutely.
if possible, but in our 20s it's just so pivotal. What happened? So what happened next?
So I did the 1 year internship, went back to the States, worked there for a bit, and then I got called back. But this time I got called back to work, to actually work, and
For money.
for the yen. And so I wasn't really an employee. I was basically a contractor, a freelancer for most of it, and that was wonderful. It was great because then I wasn't just stuck at one studio. I got to be everywhere, and then eventually, even the live action studios and the directors would call me up to do work because basically my work was storyboarding. Storyboarding is when you get a script. A lot of directors, they know what they want in their heads, but a lot of them can't draw. And so instead of drawing stick figures and then showing the rest of the production team, this is what I want, they hire someone like me, where like I'll spend a great deal of time with the directors and understand what they want and how they feel about stuff, and then I'll take the script and draw it out like a very long comic book with all the camera moves, everything. And then
Wow.
once that's approved, that gets moved on to the rest of the production team. So it's easy to look at. When you read something, it can be interpreted so many different ways depending on who that person is. But with a
Mhm.
drawing, it's clear.
That's amazing. See, I didn't even know that. I mean, it makes sense that that would be a thing, but I didn't even know it was a thing.
Yeah. So that's
That's
what I did, and
cool.
it was a lot of fun.
And
I
so
love
you
the hustle.
and you worked with different studios in
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah.
That's amazing.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun until it wasn't. At one point, oh, I guess this will go to the next story, but it was great. I absolutely loved it. I thought I was going to do that for the rest of my life until my son was born, and I missed out basically on the first 2 years of his life.
Oh no.
Yeah,
That stinks.
it does. I remember.
Was your wife in the US?
No, we were together.
Good.
By that time, I was back in the U.S.
Mm.
and working in Los Angeles, but it's just so much time gets taken away, and then when I'm on set, it's your phones are off, you can't see anything, read anything, and by the time I get home, he's already asleep, or I'm
Mm.
out on a shoot for like 2 or 3 months, and I don't get to see them. And
Yeah.
so, as much fun as that was as when I was young, not being able to see him sucked. And
Yeah.
I remember holding him, and one of the few times I actually got to see him, his first reaction was just push me away and start crying because he didn't know me.
Oh, how
And I was like,
sad.
yeah. And I was like, oh, this sucks. And so my wife, Hazel, she said, she suggested, you like Gyotaku so much. And that's where I picked it up in Japan. And it was
Yeah.
a hobby that I did
You
in
said you
between.
saw it in a tackle store for the first
Yeah.
time, right?
Yeah.
So I assume you were fishing while you were in Japan
A lot.
and probably making a lot of friends in the fishing world.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. And you saw it there. Tell us a little bit about when you first saw the art form and what that meant for you, and when you started practicing, and who showed you. Did you just search it, or did somebody show you the ropes? How'd that happen?
Okay. So yeah, what I went to a tackle shop. I mean, just about any tackle shop in Japan, Korea as well. You'll see Gyotaku prints all over the place. And my first reaction was like, whoa, that's so cool. I mean, it looks like a fossil on paper.
Yeah.
And, I've seen skin mounts, and I've seen, fiberglass mounts. And I mean, not to knock on anyone who does skin mounts, but
No.
eventually they turn into mummies. They dry out, and, I'm not sure
Yeah.
quite. Yeah, my
It's
wife would.
also, it's just a completely different. It's just a completely different art form.
Right. I mean, when it's done well, it's great. But it was different. It looked really classical to me, which I was immediately attracted to. And yes, I can I take a selfie of me and my fish or something, or have someone take a photo. But ultimately, it's just a photo. It's important, but unless that person who's taking a photo is really good at taking photos, it's just a photo. But this was like, wow, I would be happy to put this up on my wall.
Yeah.
And if my kid caught one, I would be thrilled to like print it for him so that he can keep it forever. Because that's the thing, there's so many memories that gets infused into one of these things. Uh, They're great. They're absolutely great.
How so? Expand on that.
Okay, here's a story. So when I was in France, I met with one of the lead artists over there who does the same thing, a lot of nature printing, and he invited me to his studio, and he said, I really appreciate your work. I really respect your work, and I noticed that you don't embellish your work or try to fix it or whatever. Do you know why that's so important, Dwight? And I was like, I just think it looks better, because like once you start fixing stuff up, it starts to look fixed. But whatever, to each their own. And he's like, no, Dwight, it's so much more than that. It's so much more than aesthetics. I was like, oh yeah? He goes, here is a theoretical question. You love your sons, I guess. And he goes, okay, imagine that your house is burning down and you only have time to run in there and grab one of three things. One is a painting of your child's hand. One is a photograph of your child's hand. And the third is the actual handprint. Which would you save? Oh, that's easy. I'll save the handprint. And he asked me why. It's like, because his hand touched it. He's like, Dwight, but do you realize out of those three art forms, as wonderful as each of them are, the handprint is by far the roughest looking one. It's really messy and rough. You would still choose that one? It's like, yeah, absolutely. And I was like, wow, what a moment. And then he asked me, would you take your child's handprint and would you draw a line around it to make it clean? I said, no. Would you color it? Would you fix it up? It's like, no, it's perfect as it is.
That is beautiful. I really like that.
Oh, I do too. It's stuck with me ever since. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, that one is stuck with me as well. I was like, definitely the handprint. Pick the handprint, Dwight. No, yeah. I was rooting for the handprint. No, but it's so true. It's so true. Like having that, and it's interesting. It's interesting to hear that because I'm not even really exactly sure what's always like attracted me to Gyotaku and looking for the eye roll. And but that like really that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
This concept of the fact that it's almost like, because you have to, and I could be wrong, but I would think that the fish has to be fresh. It has to be fresh to be printed unless it's like probably like vacuum sealed and frozen really well and gutted properly and all that stuff, but it has to be fresh to be printed. It's a recent, and in a time, that would mean that it's in a time where it's a really recent memory, where the angler is still experiencing what that catching that fish, fighting that fish, landing that fish was like. And it's all, manifesting the energy around a situation, around a memory, and putting that on paper directly through direct like contact. It makes sense that it would hold a lot of energy into it.
It really does.
Can you expand on it? Do you want to expand on that? Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how to expand on that.
Yeah, you don't have to. I just was like, just taking the handprint story, I just kind of went off on that because you've essentially given me an epiphany as to why I like the art form, like the artwork so much, why it's so powerful, because it is powerful and it's raw. And I like that yours is so raw. And I guess go ahead and please continue your story on, your career path, how you got out of filmmaking and into fish printing and what that looked like for you. Cause I'm sure there were quite a few challenges along the way, but you essentially said, you finished off saying your wife Hazel said, and I don't think you expanded.
Oh yeah. That. Wow. You have a really good memory. I'm impressed.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm an active listener.
You clearly are.
That's what my mama says.
Because I would have forgotten if you didn't bring it back up.
Well, I'm glad. Tell me what Hazel said. I want to know.
Okay, so Hazel suggested you like fish printing so much. Why don't you, everything you do, you put it, over 110% into it. Why don't you do the same with fish printing? And I was like, my first reaction was, that's a dumb idea. Like, why would I do that? And it's partly because I wasn't ready to leave what I had just spent 20 years of my life doing.
Of course.
And it was so difficult. A lot of soul searching, a lot of breaking down. I felt like a failure. I felt like things, it has to end this way. And I was really lost, and it was really difficult. But ultimately, every time
I assume, and I hate to interrupt you, but like, it's not like, I mean, nobody's path is easy. Nobody's path is easy, but I feel like when you have to fight so hard to be on your path, and then you get put in that space 20 years down the line, it's got to be very challenging in its own right.
It was really, really tough. The whole fight with struggle with the parents, their disapproval, and then the film industry itself. There's so many. I have so many really, really wonderful best friends, and then there's a handful of people that just, I hope I never ever see it ever again. There's a lot of egos. There's all kinds of stuff, and so I found myself having to struggle and fight through all those too. And so when it finally came down to me having to let go of this career path, it's like all those memories of fighting and just pushing forward, and it all came back all at once. It was tough to accept, but ultimately, while I was struggling with all this, my dad passed away, and
I'm sorry.
Well, happens to everyone, right? And so it was tough because I really wanted to show him one day that, like, whether it's through film or this, that I can do well. And I think that was a big pivotal moment for me. And I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I mean, I could die the next day. I could be gone real quick too. Yeah, whatever I do, I got to make it worth it, especially with my time with my kid. And that ultimately it boiled down to that. And so I sort of accepted my fate and said, okay, fine, this is what I'll do. I'll do what I can. The nice thing is it keeps me home. I get to spend 24/7 with my kid. But luckily, as soon as I made the decision, like, wonderful things just started happening. One of the first things that happened, which is bizarre, is like Patagonia reached out. I thought it was a spam email at first. And I ignored it. And I was like, that's spam. And they reached out again. I was like, oh, shoot.
What did it say?
Well, they said they wanted me to do a book cover for them. And I was like, yeah, that's a bunch of BS.
That's not real. Ignore.
Yeah, I did. I totally did. And they came back, and instances like that happened over and over. Me ignoring and then them coming back. That happened several times.
So funny, Dwight. That is so funny.
Yeah.
But that's amazing. I mean, Patagonia reached out and was like, I want you to, like, our art for our book cover. That's incredible. What else happened?
Gosh, this is pretty neat. So commercial fishermen invited me up to Unalaska, over to Dutch Harbor, and on this remote island. It was really neat. And while I was there, someone had told me that Jeremy Wade was filming and interviewing people. And then while I was at this, like, sort of potluck community event, he just walks right in. I was like, oh my gosh, I know that guy. And he's like, yeah, people have been talking about you. I came to meet you and see what you do. And this was just all still really early on. I mean, this was only a few weeks after my dad passed away, and me realized, okay, I got it. This is what I'm going to do. Yeah.
That's incredible.
It was pretty neat.
Yeah. So it's kind of just like the stars aligned.
Yeah.
This is what I'm supposed to be doing, or at least this is what I'm supposed to be doing right now.
Right now, yeah.
And you just kind of kept following the path. It sounds like that was just like full on, like, full moon, like, and you're just following the path, like Yellow Brick Road style.
Yeah, completely. I couldn't ignore it. As much as, like, deep down, I wanted to ignore it and, like, find any sort of excuse to go back to the film world, but I could not ignore it. All the things that were happening.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So you combined your passion, essentially. I mean, you just said earlier, like at the start of the podcast, that you, like, when you were a kid, you liked art and you liked fishing. So you just combined those two passions and have created an entire career of it.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. I want to talk a little bit, also, like, shout out to Hazel for being like, this is what you need to do. Despite you, like, kind of like fighting her, you're already like, this is the stupidest idea. Like, here we are. So way to go, Hazel. Yeah. No one is surprised. Wife knows best, you know what I mean?
Clearly,
but she helps you with a lot of your work, right?
She does. So a lot of times, I mean, I typically, Gyotaku is done by one person, whoever's actually doing it. We've developed our own style where she'll assist. These days, my son assists a lot more now, which is a lot of fun. Holding the paper, so to prevent it from touching certain areas prematurely, or keeping the paper down so it doesn't come up and cause a double image or whatever. But now she spends all her time in the garage. She's completely taken over the garage and turned it into her workshop, because she builds all the frames and scrolls and whatnot.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It's pretty cool.
So wait, hold on. She builds the frames and scrolls. Mm-hmm. So when you say frames and scrolls, I'm thinking scrolls as in rolls of paper and frames as in framing. So what is the scroll?
The scroll, like the East Asian scrolls that you see, that has a bunch of calligraphy on it, or ink painting on it.
Okay, so like the wall scrolls. Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Yeah, and that's all the traditional ways of doing it, it's not just two sticks with paper rolled around it. It's pretty complex, the whole process.
I bet. Is Hazel also Korean American?
No, she's Korean. She's born and raised there. Yeah.
How'd y'all meet?
That's an interesting story. So in Korea, Japan as well, but not so much, they have this thing called, in English, it's basically their version of the arranged marriage, but it's not totally arranged. You're not completely forced into it. But it was funny. I remember finishing a film project, getting off the plane. I really needed a break. I was so burnt out. And I went over to Korea to visit my folks. And as soon as I got off the plane, my mom goes, those Korean matchmaking things that you say you absolutely will not do? I was like, yeah. So you go get dressed. You got 3 today. I was like, what? No, I don't want to do that. And
you pursued your art career, but you still have to meet the ladies.
Yes. And it's so awkward. I remember arguing with her, telling her, like, I'm American. I'm from the West. I don't do this stuff. Like, I want to meet my girl at a church or a bar, like, or anywhere, everything in between. Not this.
Yeah.
But it worked out.
But here we go. We have Hazel, and now you're really good at your job.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the art form itself.
Okay.
I have a couple questions for you on that. So what would be the ideal? We kind of already touched on how fresh is best on the fish, but I would assume that, and I could be wrong, but I would assume that the moisture of the skin probably plays a significant role on that you need to have a certain amount of moisture or lack of moisture when fish printing. Can you outline what it's like what you look for ideally in a fish when you're printing,
Mm-hmm.
and how you might mitigate potential issues that you come up with if a fish is too dry or too wet, or what's the ideal situation and how do you get to that point?
Okay. Ideally, fresh is best. It really is. What also works is if you were to acquire a fish, vacuum seal it. It's air that really messes it up. Vacuum seal it, freeze it, uh, and then print it after you thaw it, and that works totally fine too. Now the fish naturally comes with a whole lot of slime. Some fish more so than others.
Yeah.
But you have to get rid of all that slime, um, because if you don't, your fish print will look like a dark black fish silhouette.
Ugh, yeah. The
Yeah.
slime is like the immune system of the fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's full of bacteria too. So I imagine if you don't get rid of the slime, it probably stinks.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
Especially like, for example, carp. I enjoy printing carp. They're just loaded with slime, and so if you don't remove that immediately, it really stinks. But I prefer acquiring a fish that actually still retains the slime, because then that means the skin, the surface underneath it is still good. It's fresh, and so that slime is important. And I would much rather have the control of removing that slime and then working with what's underneath, rather than a fish that's been out on the fish market table outside, where all the fish slime has like dissolved and it's gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you take it off do you rinse it to take it off, or do you use paper towels?
Paper towels, rinsing it off. Salt helps. Uh, yeah. Jeremy Wade actually suggested that I use a spoon, because this is a story. So this is something he was taught by, I forget, some tribe, but they would take a spoon and they would scrape it off, and it works really well too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Different fish have different amounts of slime, different types of scales too. Do
Yeah.
you see, does your prepping process vary based on the type of scale of the fish? For example, tuna versus snapper and that sort of thing. How does that look?
Absolutely. So over the years, I've built up a sort of library of what it takes for me to, because I do a lot of tests before I actually do the print, and I keep those tests because they're useful for me, and I remember them. I was like, oh yeah, that's how I went about that particular fish. Some fish have scales that just fall off really easily, like a salmon, anchovy, sardines. You look at them wrong, and then
Their scales pop off for sure.
Scales pop off. Then you got fish that have really durable scales, like a koi or a snapper. There's some fish like the red snapper. There's one called, it's a deep sea. I can't remember. It has a really big eye. Their scales, they have big, beautiful scales, but they're so difficult to print because they have microscopic ridges on the scale that prevent the paper from touching all of it. And it's really difficult.
So you have to individually
You have
push.
to make, what I do is I end up mixing my ink thicker so that it there's more of a surface area for the paper to contact with. Yeah.
Fascinating.
And so every fish has a different approach. You can approach it all the same way, but ideally, you'll fine tune each particular fish with a different process.
When you say that you test each fish and I think you said testing. You have little samples on each fish to figure out what process works best.
Right.
Makes sense when you say that you use a thicker paint on that one, and when the scales are a little harder to identify the ridges and all that.
Yeah.
But what are you testing? What does that look like? What does your testing process look like?
Okay, so once I remove all the slime and I'm ready for a test, I'll brush on the ink like I do most fish. and I'll test it to see if, and I'll lift it off the fish. It's a small piece of paper, and one, it'll give me information on how to go about creating a gradation, because I really enjoy creating gradations on a fish. It makes it look like you can sort of reach into the paper and pick it up.
What is a gradation?
Gradation, like a
gradation. What is
gradation.
that? Gradation.
For example, typically, take an object under the light, right? There's a dark area, there's a light area, and there's everything in between. It's a gradation. As opposed to creating a fish print that's just completely black, which is fine,
Mm-hmm.
But if I can do a gradation, why not, right? I think
you're like
better.
Animating the animal.
Yeah, well, I'm making it look as realistic and solid as possible.
I love that.
And so I'll do tests to see what it takes to create a gradation. I'll do tests to see, like, if these scales will transfer ideally or not. And then that first test will give me a great deal of information, and then I'll adjust my process. And adjusting the process, there's only three real ingredients to Gyotaku. There's the fish, there's the paper, and then your ink or paint or whatever you're using. And so if I'm restricting myself to these three things, then I'm going to modify one, two, or all of these in order to get results that are ideal.
That's cool. So your ink, Sumi, right? Tell us a little bit about that. What is it? Why? How? The ins and outs of it.
So it's the traditional ink that you'll find used for forever in all of East Asia. It's made out of pine soot. It's basically a piece of charcoal. It comes in a stick form. There's wonderful YouTube videos of how it's made. Really neat, because it takes like a year or two to make these.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, well, leave it to them to perfect it, right? It's cured over time, and I don't know the entire process, but it's pretty in depth. But basically, it's a really, really refined piece of charcoal, and these charcoal
always
sticks,
the same like color, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're always black, but they have different depending on what they're made out of and where they're made out of, where made from. You'll see like little hints, subtle hints of blue, sometimes brown. It really depends. And
cool.
It's subtle. When you just look at them, they all look black, but when you look really closely, you'll see those tints, and they're very pretty. So
it's like they're sticks of charcoal, pine soot, that are made into blocks, and then so how do you make ink out of that?
So you take one of those, and I wish I had one in front of me, but like it's called a Suzuri stone. It's a stone. In English, it starts with a P.
Pumice?
No.
It's the only stone I know that starts with a P.
Oh, no, not what the stone's made out of. The grinding stone.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
sure, grinding stone, yeah.
Okay, we'll call it grinding stone. That doesn't start with a P, but grinding stone. And so you'll pour a little water in it, you'll grind, and it can take anywhere from like 20 to 40 minutes to make your batch. It's very zen-like. And then, but the wonderful thing about creating your own ink, grinding your own ink, is you can control its consistency to match whatever you want done. I used to do a whole lot of that before, as opposed to buying ink, because a lot of the inks that you buy, they may call it Sumi ink, but they're really not. But I found a vendor now where they actually like grind it for you and sell it to you in a bottle, and it's purely ground ink. It's very expensive because it's all hand done. But it's worth it.
But it takes the time out of it. Yeah,
it takes the time out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's so that's the Sumi. Can I say Sumi ink? Probably not. That's probably like repetitive.
It's like ink. It's like chai.
Yeah.
Chai tea.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew that.
It's the same thing.
I knew that. Yeah, so so you have your Sumi, and then your paper is called Washi?
Washi. So so Washi literally means Japanese paper.
Okay.
But the thing is, essentially the same paper is used all over East Asia, right? So in Korea, it's called hanji, which literally means Korean paper. The Chinese use the same thing, and their translation is Chinese paper, but it's all the same paper. It's made out of mulberry pulp.
Cool.
A lot of Westerners will call it rice paper, and this bugs the hell out of me, by the way, because
that's what we use on spring rolls.
Yes. Oh, good for you. You're the first person I've talked to about this who would actually bring up spring rolls before I did.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm a really big eater. So
I'm impressed because
well, thank you.
Yeah, wow. That's the first time ever. Seriously. People call it rice paper because it's from the Far East. And it's like, that's lame. But but there's no rice in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, true rice paper is when you go to a Vietnamese restaurant and you get a spring roll. Good
so
for you.
Good.
My respect for you just skyrocketed.
Oh, thank you. I know it was already really high. So.
It was super high. It just crashed through the ceiling. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
It made my day.
Okay, so it's made from mulberry pulp.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which is a tree. I'm assuming a tree that's found all across Asia.
Yes.
And I'm also assuming you don't make your own paper because that sounds extremely time intensive.
It's very, very time intensive. I would need a lot of space to do it. No, I just want to get to the artwork itself.
Yeah. Okay, so you sometimes, I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. Sometimes you make your own sumi, and sometimes, probably more often, you order it and have it because you found a supplier that you really like and trust.
Yeah.
And the same can be said for your washi.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
All the
and
washi
so the way back on how you have your three items that you have the potential to manipulate: the fish, the ink, and the paper. How do you manipulate? You already spoke about the consistency of the ink. So if you get that sumi ground, so you add the water to it?
Yes. If I want. Well, it comes ground, so it's already ink-like. It's already watery. Okay. But then I'll adjust that. Like I'll add water to it, or I'll add that in lieu of water to the grinding stone and grind more directly to it. Sometimes I'll add oil to it to make it thicker.
What kind of oil?
It's this oil. I don't know what it's called in English, but it's I don't know. But it's sort of a binder. But it works well.
That's awesome. And so how would you manipulate the washi?
So different types of paper. It's not just one paper. You can use, for starters, you can choose the thickness of the paper. And that changes things quite a bit. Beginners, I highly recommend using thinner paper. It's a lot easier to wrap a thin sheet of paper around a fish than a thicker one, because the thicker one, you're starting to fight the paper itself. But
I imagine that it creases and
it does, and a lot of artists will call them, lightning strikes. But there's ways around it. You can pull and stretch, but you can pull and stretch thicker paper to do that. But the thicker paper is a lot more difficult, just because it doesn't want to wrap itself around anything that's round, and so you pull and stretch. And I use thicker paper because the results are just way more beautiful than thinner paper, because since it's thick, there's more room for the ink to penetrate, and there's this wonderful subtle dimensionality to it. It's really very pretty.
That's really cool. Yeah. So you prefer to use thicker paper. I assume that if you're using thicker paper, because you like for the ink to have a dimension to it, you probably use significantly more ink when you're using thicker paper, correct?
Yeah, that is true.
And what was the term you used earlier? It sounded like gradient, but it's not. Gradient?
Gradation.
Gradation. Yeah. So is that I want to say I. It's A. Gradation. Gradation. That makes sense. Okay. So, question for you. Let's go back to the snapper versus tuna situation, right? So a snapper is a pretty flat fish for the most part. Obviously, if they get bigger, they've got some more girth to them. Right. But they're a pretty flat fish. It would make it seems relatively in the scope of things. I'm putting quotation marks if you're listening and not watching. Relatively easy to lay a paper on a snapper, whereas a tuna is essentially like a bullet.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it's got to be. I would think that trying to lay paper on a tuna, you would have some sort of like the print would kind of morph,
Yeah.
like lose its shape, the shape of the fish. Does that happen? Obviously, yes. So can you expand on that?
So it can definitely happen. So a snapper is a lot more straightforward because yes, it's a lot flatter. Speaking of which, a flounder, it's meant for this art form. Very easy.
I love flounder. They're so perfect in
They're
every
so
way.
neat. I agree.
They are cool.
Two
They
eyes
are
on
really
one side.
Cool. Oh, so cool.
But a tuna, there's so much girth to it. So if you imagine trying to wrap a sheet of paper around, especially a thick one, around an American football, it's not going to happen. And if you lift up the paper, you're going to get an image that doesn't look like an American football. It's going to look like something completely. Yeah, it's going to look like
rectangular.
Yeah,
more rectangular than anything.
Right.
Right.
It's not going to look proportionally correct. So tuna is exactly the same way. So you can print it, without, what's the right word? Okay, so I do these extra steps when printing a tuna or anything that has a lot of girth to it. Is what I'll do is I'll print the body, the main body, and this is actually the difficult part, is to have print enough of the surface of the tuna to make it look proportionally correct. And so I'll bring out like a tape measure and measure it out and make sure it's equal to whatever it's supposed to look like. And then lift up the paper. And then after that, I can either cut off the fins, remove the fins, and then use them as a stamp and complete the image so that then it would look proportionally correct. Or if I'm working with scientists, I can't cut off the fins. And so what I'll do is I'll lift up the paper, mark it where the fins are supposed to be, ink the fins separately, and then lay the paper back down to get those images.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But
I'm so sorry. I didn't really see the difference there. I think that might have been me. So
okay.
On both of those situations, you remove the fins.
No.
No.
The first one is to remove the fins. The second one, if I can't remove the fins, I will lift up the paper and then sort of print the fins while
directly.
They're still on the fish, while covering everything else up so it doesn't touch the rest of it.
That seems extremely stressful.
It is, especially when we're working. Like, for example, we printed this very rare anglerfish called the football fish.
Check out my cup.
Look at that!
I love this cup. It's my favorite cup, which says something because I have some cool cups, but this is by far the best. You guys, it's a octopus printed Yeti that Dwight gifted me several years ago, and I absolutely love it. So anyway,
we don't even make those anymore because they're so time consuming. We're like, no,
limited edition.
There you go.
and I got it as a gift. Thank you.
Did.
No, yep. I really do love it. Sorry, I interrupted you. I'm just thirsty. So
where was I?
The oarfish. No, not the oarfish, which we're going to get to later. The anglerfish, right. Yeah.
Anglerfish. And so the anglerfish has this thing called an eska. Most people call it the lure. It lights up.
Yeah.
It attracts.
It's a fascinating fish.
Pretty neat.
It's so
very,
cool.
Very rare fish.
And super deep water.
Super deep water. In fact.
And so, yeah, continue. In fact.
So, it's so rare that even a lot of scientists have never seen one, studied one, been in contact with one.
Yeah. And you guys, so these fish, if you want to just Google it real quick, and I'll try and put one on here. I'm doing my editing myself right now, so if I don't, forgive me. But an anglerfish is this deep water fish, and they just have these like serious teeth, and they're like a very odd shape, and they have what Dwight's calling. He already told us the regular name,
but
eska. Eska, which I blacked out when you said lure. I'm like, it's the lure, and it lights up and attracts smaller fish, and it hangs right in front of his head or its head. And when it attracts smaller fish, it then goes forward and eats the smaller fish, which has got to be seriously the coolest evolutionary thing, or whatever you want to say, creative thing. But biologically, it is fascinating. So
I mean, it's an angler. It's literally it's us, right?
yeah. Literally, like, take the bait, you stupid fish. Anyway, continue, please.
I'm sorry, I always blank out.
So you had the anglerfish.
Right. And so we're surrounded by like a dozen scientists, all making sure that we don't, damage the specimen, because it really is so rare. And normally, if I were to print something like that, I would cut off the lure and just print it separately. It's a lot easier that way. And so, but since we can't, nor did I want to, especially for something like this, we print the main body, lift it up, and then realign it so that we can print the esca on the second pass. So essentially, that's the same thing with like larger fish. If we're unable to print something that I would prefer to remove.
So I've heard you say in different mediums before that a lot of times when you're printing a fish, you take different takes. Essentially, you have a lot of times it'll take you multiple attempts before you get one that you're happy with. Right. So that's just got to be, when I look at some of your artwork, you've just got some incredible artwork where you have very dynamic prints, one with fish, but also I've seen you're getting more and more into printing people, which I think is fascinating. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but it's not uncommon to see that you have multiple fish in one print, where you have like maybe a bait ball and a predator fish coming up on it or something like that. How do you do that if it's multiple attempts per fish? Like, that's got to be extremely time intensive or extremely stressful. Like, can you expand on that?
Well, it used to be stressful. I've gotten used to it. Time intensive, yes, because I can't print the entire school of fish or the main fish all on one pass. It's all one at a time, and so it's time intensive. And if I screw it up, then there's not a whole lot that I can do about it. I have to start over. And so the more fish there are, the more elements there are, the more I like to embellish the prints with kelp. Adds a wonderful flow to it.
Super
These
cool.
days, I'm adding a lot of ink washes and this process called Sumi nagashi, which literally means flow of water. But what that is it's marbling. You float I float the ink on the surface of the water. I'm literally printing the paper. And so there's a crazy lack of control with that process, because imagine trying to control water. You really can't. And so let's say I already have this fish or octopus or whatever it is that's on the paper, and it looks great, it's wonderful, and then sort of haphazardly,
exactly what you want.
Yeah, and then sort of haphazardly dipping that into a vat of water with ink in it and hoping for the best. It's but I've gone to the point where I'm like, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. Even if I screw it up, I'll do it better the second time. So it's fine.
Oh my gosh. Bless you. To each his own, Dwight. I don't know if I could emotionally handle that.
Well, in the beginning it was tough, but you get used to it.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's so cool. Okay. So when you were doing the anglerfish, who was that with?
That was with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. And then I got to print a second and third one with the Scripps Institute.
Cool.
Right next to NOAA.
In San Diego.
Yeah, in San Diego.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Scripps is doing some really, really cool stuff.
Oh, they're great. I love that community.
That is so cool. I've heard amazing things. So a year ago or so, I'm not sure, time is strange, but I saw a friend of mine that I also know through social media caught or saw actually an oarfish floating off of Baja, and it had been kind of eaten. You guys, an oarfish is this really, it's a creature of the deep for the most part, but it can be found in the shallows as well. And it's a really crazy fish that we know very little about. And essentially it looks like a long ribbon fish with a mahi head and teeth, I think, if I
It doesn't
remember
have a whole lot
correctly.
of
It
teeth.
doesn't have a lot of teeth.
Not that I remember.
So it's been a while since I looked into the oarfish, but it's like this really fascinating looking fish, but they can get so big. And I
Yeah.
posted this reel about the oarfish because I was like, what the heck is that? And then I dove down the research wormhole, and I made a little educational reel about it because I wanted to learn. And you commented, I remember you commented,
yeah.
I've always wanted to print one of those.
Yeah.
And then literally weeks later, Mr. Manifest,
Yeah.
you're like, you printed one. So tell us about what happened there, because I was just blown away. I was like, oh my gosh, Dwight, you just like literally like manifested that.
Yeah, that was pretty neat. That was the oarfish has been on the top of my wish list for a very long time, just
And why is that? Yeah.
because it's so cool. It's so different. It's so cool. It reminds me of these like serpentine dragons of Asia, and I was like, wow, they do exist.
Yes.
And
that's a great representation.
Right. It kind of looks like what is it, Falcor, the white dragon from
Yes, from the Never Ending Story. Is that what the movie?
Story? Yeah.
Falcor. That's awesome.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
Also,
Nerd moment.
Yeah. That was fun for me.
But yeah, so I have a lot of friends over at Scripps and Noah, and one showed up and conversation started real quick, and they said, would you like to print it? I said, yes, I'd like to print it. Like I've had rolls of like paper long enough to print one of these things, just hidden away in my closet for the longest time, just in case.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Good for you. So what did that process look like? Oh my gosh.
The thing was so long. I needed I think it was four or five extra people to hold the paper and help me out. It was very watery, had a really weird jelly-like texture with hard, scabby areas intermittently.
Cute.
Yeah, real trip. And the paper, I've noticed during the testing part of it, the paper can only really touch the surface of this fish because it's so watery for only a few seconds. And so what we had to do,
oh my goodness,
is prepare the ink, brush as fast as we could, and that's tough since it was like a 12, 13 foot long creature. And my arms were burning by the end of the day. And then what we do is we sort of have the paper draped over it, and then press, and then after a few seconds, the people behind on the right side of me would lift up the paper so it doesn't blow out the image, and because of all the moisture, and we'd sort of like do this rolling thing all across it in order to get it.
Right, because it's not like you could put ink on the whole thing and then press it in one go.
No, it didn't work that way. It was just too big, and it's too wet.
Your ink would dry, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you said 12, 13 foot long?
Yeah, something like that.
That is so big. That is so cool. Okay, so how many takes did it take? How many attempts?
If I remember right, we got 3 or 4 attempts in, and they all looked good, fortunately, because the testing part of it went really smoothly. And then I had to relinquish control over it so that they could cut it up and preserve it.
That was probably pretty hard for you.
I was like, oh, give me one more hour.
One more chance. That's amazing. Well, I saw the print and it looks absolutely amazing. Like, good for you. I mean, it's really fascinating because I remember when I was researching this fish that the consistency, the gelatinous consistency of the animal was one of the key things that the scientists know about it, right? So we know when they wash up, essentially when we find these oarfish, it's because they have died and are now on the surface or on the beach. Yeah. And it's just like, that must have been in itself extremely challenging, just based on the conversation we had earlier, where you're like, I keep my tests so that I can know how to remember how to print these specific types of fish, how I want my ink, how I want my paper. So having to do all of that in the public's eye, essentially. Like, you probably had quite a were a lot of people watching?
There were a lot of people watching. Yeah.
Have you gotten, like, I assume probably better and better at printing in front of people? Was that something that was kind of a difficult transition? Because I assume in the film world, you probably weren't working in front of a lot of people.
No, I've never worked in front of an audience before, not in the film industry. But I do have a tendency to, when I'm working on something, and my sister calls me like hyper focused. I don't I can't see or hear anything else.
You
And
zone
I guess
everyone
that's a
out.
blessing. It just happens automatically, to the point where the funny stories of I'll be working on something and Hazel will be in the back either vacuuming or moving the sofa to a new spot because she likes it better there, all by herself, and making a lot of noise. Apparently, I don't know. And then I'll get up from what I do. I'm like, oh, okay, I need a break, and then I'll see the entire living room rearranged. Whoa! Like, you could have asked me for
Right,
help.
right under my nose. I had no
Yeah,
idea.
I had no idea. It's like, you don't hear anything. It's like, no, I don't.
Wow, that's cool. That's amazing. Is that that's probably a pretty similar like feeling and mindset that you get when you're fishing too,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, I go fishing sometimes with friends, usually alone, but sometimes with friends. I'm like, Dwight, look at that mountain, so beautiful, dude. I'm looking at my float while we're drifting down the stream. Don't distract me.
Get your mountains out of here.
Yeah, I don't. My wife never calls me because she knows I'm not going to pick up the phone because I never look at my phone when I'm fishing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So your son is almost 12.
Yeah.
And y'all like to go fishing together, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And does he help you with your art as well?
He does now. Yeah.
Yeah, you said that earlier that he's gotten a little bit more involved. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with him and with your art, with fishing, and how that has that changed your work at all? Like having your son and having him around, like what's that like?
Well,
Has that influenced you?
Well, just because just having my son around, just that alone doesn't want it prevents me from wanting to ever go back to the film world again. I'm not sure if it's worth it anymore. There's parts of me that I'm like, oh yeah, I miss that, and I miss this, and I miss the cruise, but no, it's great, and he homeschools, and so like we are always together. In fact, even when I'm asleep, he sleeps right next to me, and so like we were always together. Um, he helps out when we would create work. In fact, the majority of the new octopus pieces that we've done were with him.
Those are really cool, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. He likes to print as well. He's really good about organizing, helping me out with logistics when we go do an event. He always mans the merchandise table, which is funny because I give him a percentage. And then, yeah, I mean, it's been so much fun. It's really rewarding, just wonderful. I would never trade it.
That's really cool. I mean, you guys have pretty much built a business around your family. Well, not built a business around your family, but a business that's family oriented.
Yeah,
And I think that that's really special when you are pursuing your passions. Like,
yeah,
for example, Drake and I, we're on the ocean, we're fishing, but we're doing it together. And I
yeah,
think that if we weren't, it wouldn't be possible. And
yeah,
it's the whole that's kind of like the whole premise of it, of pursuing your passions, pursuing what makes you happy and being successful in it, and having those that you love and that love you in that with you. I mean, every accomplishment you have is also an accomplishment to them, right?
completely. Yeah, absolutely. It's so
But
rewarding. It's wonderful. I'm glad it worked out this way.
me too. That is so cool.
Yeah,
Question for you.
yeah.
For the pelagic print, where
Uh-huh.
you have the marlin, how did you do that?
So we were. Oh, you mean the Gyotaku print itself?
Yes.
Yeah. So we were in Kona on the Big Island of Hawaii, and we were actually we were celebrating our 10th anniversary or something like that. And I remember my wife specifically saying, you know, you can fish all you want. We're not taking any, you know, we're not doing any fish prints while we're there. It's, you know, we want to enjoy it. It's like, you got it. And then I told one of my, I didn't, I posted it on Instagram on one of my stories that, oh, I'm here in Kona, like, you know, let's meet up, whoever, you know, go fishing or whatever. And this guy reaches out and he goes, is there a fish that you would like to print? I was like, honestly, it would be a marlin. It's like, I've never printed one. I've never actually seen one in person. I would love to print one. And the next day he goes, okay, Dwight, I have a striped marlin. It's sitting on my kitchen counter right now, waiting for you. And I was like, sweetheart, we gotta go. We gotta go to Kona.
Sorry, Hazel.
And she's like, oh, she rolled her eyes. Like, okay, fine. I'll make it up to you. And so we printed it on his kitchen counter.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and that's
Did you cut the fins off and everything?
No, not
I mean, that
for
must
that
have
one.
been really no. It must have been challenging.
It was pretty challenging. That was the only surface, and so I had to climb on top of the kitchen counter to do it. And he gave me some beef about, you know, going up on his kitchen counter with my socks on and whatnot, but like it had to be done.
At least your shoes weren't on.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful print and I just absolutely love it. It's so cool.
Thanks.
What if, so for somebody like I would love to try to fish print.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to, just like some of my catches, obviously nothing to like sell or give to anyone really even, but just, I feel like for me, when I catch a fish, if I'm harvesting it, it's very important for me that I kill it immediately, that I bleed it, that I treat it in the best possible way by putting in an ice slurry, making sure that meat is going to be as good as possible. Thanks to the Japanese ikejime, which I have studied a little bit. I'm not by any means super proficient in it, but I do practice it when I can to the best of my knowledge and capabilities.
Yeah.
I find, and same way in my hunting world, if I'm going to take a life, I want to respect that life and utilize it to its fullest on my table, in my kitchen, feeding my family and friends. But the idea of, you know, going back to the handprint conversation, the idea of being able to preserve that fish in a whole other way and utilize that fish and keep that fish in my life in a whole other way is very enticing for me. So as like for a novice that's just wanting like a hobby out of it, what would you recommend I do? What would you recommend I get, like products and what's your recommendation there on the best steps for me to build out like elementary fish prints?
Well, two things, I guess. Just dive into it. You know, just diving straight into it, you'll quickly learn what works and what doesn't, and then you'll adjust accordingly. And then two, and this is something, I mean, both of these things are things that I did when I was in Japan. I didn't have anyone to teach me. I remember bringing it up with my Japanese friends, like, oh, do you know about this? Like, this is something I want to do. And they all sort of shook their heads and shrugged. Like, why would you want to do that? You know, only elementary kids who are trying to better their motor skills or really old salty fishermen do this. Like, no one cares about this stuff. I care. And so I couldn't find someone. I couldn't find someone. And so I just did what anyone else does today, is just pour through YouTube.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of videos on the basics, and they all teach the same thing. Brush ink, put paper on it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you start. And so, you know, and then you, my friend, you can text me whenever, and I'll give you pointers on how to go about stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. But
do you recommend that I get like proper Sumi and Washi, or like
no, not in the beginning.
What do you think I should use?
So like real proper like Sumi ink, depending on the grade, Like it can cost anywhere between $5 to like $3,000 for a stick.
That's crazy.
It's
but also
crazy.
not shocking,
Not
really.
shocking at all. The more expensive ones, they're amazing. But
I bet.
I mean, if you're just starting out, I would just get something on Amazon. Am I allowed to say Amazon?
Yeah, you're allowed.
Yeah, or whatever. And then find paper. Unfortunately, on Amazon you'll have to like type in rice paper, even though it's not rice paper.
Stop! Really?
Yeah, and so that's what you would have to do. Unfortunately.
So if I search Sumi on Amazon, I probably have to search Sumi ink.
Yes.
So
Sumi ink, like chai tea.
Right. So I'm gonna okay. Sumi ink on Amazon, and I'll come up with like a cheapy-ish version, and then rice paper for printing, for art, maybe
just
on
for
Amazon.
Art for paint. Yeah, I mean they're all made for the same thing, painting or calligraphy. Either one works.
That's cool.
Yeah, and then that's what you can start out with. And seriously, it's people might get intimidated or nervous about doing their first one. It's like you really shouldn't be. You just, who cares about failure? Just dive into it, and you'll quickly learn.
I post content on social media, so I feel like printing a fish in private seems pretty. I feel like I'm gonna be fine, but I will let you know.
You're gonna be fine. I love your content. You're so funny on Instagram. I love it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, cool. Well, I'm excited to try it out. I'll let you know how it goes, but it'll be fun for me. I wanted to get into before we wrap up, which I've really enjoyed this chat, and I really appreciate your time. I want to get into, I've noticed that you're starting to do prints, or you have started. I'm not sure how long you've been doing it, but prints of people that also integrate nature into, so that there is a story behind the print. And I find that really magical, and your work is very impressive. I really liked the one, I think it was, I wrote it down actually, Jane Lebensko?
Yes.
We'll go with it.
Wrong, but yes.
Okay, wrong. Jane. We'll call her Jane.
Jane, yeah.
She had like the octopus hair, and I mean, her hair was made of octopus tentacles, and it was, so much more. There was marine life all around her, and the story that I got was, raising stewards of the ocean, and you have really powerful stories in your artwork that I saw on your website. And what's caused you to start printing people? When did that start, and why?
So every once in a while, people would ask me if I would print a person, and I've seen. I mean, there's not a whole lot of examples of this, but I've seen people print human prints before, and they looked awful. Like they looked like cadavers on paper. I was like, oh, that's nasty. And so I sort of
steer away.
Yeah, I shied away from it. And then not a lot, but there's a handful of people that reached out and said, they wanted vanity prints of themselves or someone important to them. There's one guy who asked me for that if I would be willing to print, and I quote, his hot ex-girlfriend, and she'd be totally into it. And I was like, no, that's not what I do. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of weird.
People are so weird. Fish are better.
At least you know what the fish are going to do, right?
Yeah, they're predictable.
Yeah, they're pretty predictable. So, yeah, it was never on my radar until the whole Black Lives Matter movement was happening. And, me being Asian, I'm a minority. I have my own stories. I don't often share, but like I have my own stories of hardships and whatever, being picked on. And it really struck a chord with me, and I wanted to be a part of the conversation and share. But I wasn't sure how. I'm not articulate enough to like stand up and make a speech or whatever. And a friend of mine's like, just do what you know how to do. I was like, oh yeah, duh. And so I invited a black friend over, and we printed his fist in the Black Lives Matter logo. And I didn't really think very much on it, or I didn't think ahead on like what to do with it. I just wanted to do it. I just needed to, I guess, I needed some sort of outlet. And so we did that, and I posted it on Instagram, and I just got flooded with all these messages about how do I get a print of this? I was like, I didn't think that far, which I rarely do. The more you get to know me, I don't think a whole lot. I just sort of do stuff. And so the next day I said, okay, how about this? Like, anyone who's interested in a print, you guys can donate $50 to your preferred local Black outreach community, whatever, and show me the receipt, pay for $10 for shipping. I'll send you a print. And we ended up raising like, I don't know, it was like $4,000 or $5,000 in a week. It was crazy.
That's so cool, Dwight.
It was really encouraging for me more than anything. I was like, oh, people do care. People, do want to know what goes on with like other people's lives. It was really encouraging.
And it put a different value to your work.
Yeah. And so that was the first time I printed a person. I was like, oh, well, if it's telling somebody's story, then I'd be interested in doing it, not some hot ex-girlfriend. This, yes. And so I started talking to social workers, and they were telling me about, the people they work with, communities, hardships, triumphs. I was like, this is amazing. Like, these are the kind of stories I would love to showcase and portray. For example, there's this very wonderful, special woman in San Diego, and she was a sex trafficking survivor. So she got sold off when she was 12 by her stepdad. Her mother turned a blind eye for whatever reason. And
is that in Mexico?
Yes, in Tijuana. And she left the world when she was 18. And, I read articles about this along with other news articles. It's like, oh, that's terrible. I shake my head and I swipe and I go to the next one. I don't really think too far into it until I heard it from her own lips. And I was like, whoa, you're just a baby then. At
12 is
what
a
do you
child.
know? Yeah. And, and I end up comparing it with my own son. It's like, can you imagine if that were to, it's awful. And so, and she didn't, mince words or hold anything back when she was telling me about it. I was like, that's awful. And so the process is we'll listen to a person's story, we'll print their face, the same process, same materials that we use with fish, and then I'll recreate their hair and their bodies, clothing, or whatever with things from nature that best represents them. And with her, I was really unsure of how to go about it. It was a sensitive subject, and I didn't want to mess it up. And so
that's a lot of weight.
It's a lot of weight. It's a lot of pressure. It's I don't want
somebody else's story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. But as an artist, you want to represent them in the best way possible.
Totally. And I didn't want to rush this one. And it took me about 6 months. But, the process itself was easy and quick, but I didn't know how to go about it. It wasn't until one day I took my son to the park. And I was just watching him play with the other kids there, and eventually they started picking up dandelion seed puffs. I don't know what you call them, those seed puffs. And they would blow on them, make wishes. Well, all those wishes were really frivolous. They're like, I want a new Xbox, or I want these new shoes, or I want this doll, or whatever. I want this boy to like me.
I want the ice cream truck to show up.
Yeah, stuff like that. Real innocent, And I
thought, they should be. How they should be at age 11, 12.
How they should be. And that's when I made the connection. Oh, I'm sure she would love to have made all these frivolous wishes, carefree
Yeah.
wishes. But
And she didn't have that luxury.
no, she didn't. And so I decided, oh, we'll turn her into a dandelion. And so I printed, I don't know how many dandelion seeds to construct her hair, thousands, and then dandelion flowers
Gosh,
and leaves and whatnot all around her, to create that piece.
it's a beautiful piece. I know exactly which one you're talking about. It's
Oh, good.
really, really nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, what a story.
But it's life changing when we get to meet these people.
Yeah.
They walk amongst us, you have no idea. You would have no clue until they
Survivors.
survivors. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And I
amazing.
saw that you've done multiple refugees,
Yes, yeah.
veterans of
Veterans.
Marines, and
Mhm. He was a
very,
very
very
powerful one.
powerful stories. Very
Yeah.
powerful stories. Bringing these stories to life in your artwork. I've seen like some of your fish prints. We talked a little bit about how they can be very versatile, how there can be like bait ball and kelp and the fish are feeding and this sort. And I've seen also that your fish prints aren't just of the side, like the side of the fish, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You have very cool prints where you might have like a certain degree of the fish like coming up to eat the bait where you see it at a different angle.
Hmm.
And I think that is just so impressive, and it shows your history and all of the art that you've studied, that you are in fact at your core an artist before all things,
Yeah.
and a storyteller. And I think, when I'm looking at these prints you've done, these people prints, I don't know, what are you calling them? People
I
prints?
call them human portraits. I think that's what I call them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
When I look at these human portraits, you're taking that storytelling and you're putting it to a whole new level. And I think that that's really powerful, and I think that it's very impressive. What has that journey been like for you personally?
It's been wonderful. It gives a whole new purpose. Printing fish and aquatic life is one thing. It's something I love. I have a passion for. But printing people, now it feels like I'm either helping someone out or helping that person out, or helping, more likely, the people who see it. And that's really, really uh, deeply rewarding. Um, for example, when we printed that retired Marine, he was having uh, really tough bouts with suicide, because a lot of his comrades were committing suicide, and he had his own thoughts and troubles. And
Reintegrating yourself into our society after war, I
yeah,
mean, that can't be
it's tough.
easy.
Their their world is they understand their world, and they're somebody, you know, and then they come back, and then all of a sudden they're nobody, and it's difficult. They don't know who to talk to or relate to, and everyone sort of moves at their own pace. That's different with them, and they have a hard time,
And no one understands,
and no one
because
understands.
that is a whole different world. That is a
Yeah,
whole different, like, I hate to make this about myself for a second, but like even me, like going to work on a boat in like the Canary Islands for 3
yeah,
years and coming back, like no one understands what that was like. No one,
yeah,
and I'm not gonna like preach it. It's just even for me, that's like, man, it's hard. It's hard
yeah.
to this sounds so shallow. What I'm trying to say is when you go through something in life and the people around you don't understand it, it's really hard to reintegrate yourself because you have to go back to the way they're doing things. It's
Right,
not the other way around.
right.
And for it to be something like war,
Yeah,
I mean, I just can't, the trauma that comes from those experiences. Trauma, and also, like you said, like living in like a certain way with certain responsibilities and getting, becoming so proficient in that, and then coming back and not having any of those same responsibilities, right?
right, right. Essentially losing it. Losing your that purpose,
Mhm.
what your identity, essentially. And And so when we made that print and I posted it up, I got so many messages from other veterans saying, like, thank you, basically, thank you. You understand us. Can I share this? It was really, and so then I got to share all those messages with the person we printed it. He got pretty emotional. It was really nice.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Good for you. I mean, you're making a huge difference.
Well, I mean, human stories, that's, we can relate to fish and whatnot, right? But it's a whole lot easier. It's a whole lot more direct to relate to another person's story.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Dwight. Well, on that note, powerful stuff right there. We're going to wrap it up. Can you please tell our listeners where they can find you?
Oh, they can find me on Instagram, Dwight Hwang _Gyotaku, not Gyotaku. Or you can look me up, Dwight Hwang, HWANG on the internet. You can Google it and you'll find my website.
And I will attach his Instagram as well as his website in the description below. So y'all look at that, check out his work. It's really incredible. Dwight, you have originals on your website and you also have replicas. Is that the word?
Reproductions.
Yeah. Reproductions. So for all budgets, there's options for you. Really beautiful stuff. Dwight, what is it? I ask everyone this. What is it that keeps you going back to the ocean?
It's very quieting. I can breathe.
I love that. I feel that. I feel that in my bones.
I know
ability to just breathe.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. Awesome. All right, Dwight. Well, thank you so much, you guys. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to like, share, subscribe. We really enjoyed having you here. Definitely check out Dwight's work. It's really astonishing. I can't push it enough. It's my favorite. So, as always, don't stop chasing your wild, and we'll be seeing you out there. Dwight, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.